feel like I need to preface all of this by saying that this is not a political video at all. It's just my impressions, my views, my opinions. Nothing too serious, okay? We'll talk about the best drivers, the worst drivers, cultural shocks, and whether I would ever live in the United States, for the rest of my life. Oh wait, I already do. And all right, let's get started. So, I'm Thales, I'm Brazilian. I've been living in the United States for 7 years now. But I was born in Brazil, in the capital, but raised in a very small town in Minas Gerais. And I first moved here as an exchange student and then returned again for further studies, right? The US has been my home for a while now. I lived in South Dakota, Massachusetts, Chicago, Indiana, and currently I'm living in Austin, Texas. The US is such an interesting place. Some people love it, some people hate it, majority love it. So in this video, I want to give you a little dose of how a Brazilian and perhaps many other people from different countries might perceive the US after living here for several years, right? First of all, cultural shocks. Back home in Brazil, we're somewhat familiar with American culture through movies, music, and TV shows, but it's only when you get here to the United States that you realize how different some things really are. For starters, people here tend to be very punctual for the most part. In Brazil, if you say you're meeting at 7 p.m., for example, it's totally acceptable for you to show up at 7:30 or even 8. It's part of our jeitinho brasileiro, right? That flexible way of doing things. But here in the US, if you say 7 p.m., you better be there at 6:55. People value punctuality so much, and that can be a bit of a shock. It wasn't for me. I'm very punctual, thanks Dad. But many Brazilians and people from other cultures typically have to adjust to this strict concept of time. Another cultural shock I experienced is how people greet each other. In Brazil, we're very affectionate, right? We hug, we kiss on the cheek, even when meeting someone for the first time. Here in the US, people value personal space. The first time I tried to greet someone with a kiss on the cheek, they leaned backwards awkwardly, and I realized, we don't do that here. So now I've learned to stick with a simple handshake or just a friendly wave. I have to admit, sometimes I still go for the hug. It's just how we are. Also, back home, it's common to drop by a friend's house, for example, unannounced. You just show up. And it's totally fine. They might even be expecting it, right? In the US, you need to schedule everything in advance. You can't just pop in on someone. It's considered rude. People have their schedules, their plans, and you need to respect that. This was a big adjustment, not just for me, but for many people who come to the US from different cultures where spontaneity is more like the norm. Another thing that's really surprised me is how individualistic the culture is. In Brazil, we have a very collective culture. Family is everything, we do everything together. We live with our parents until we get married, sometimes even after that. Extended family gatherings are common and we spend a lot of time together. Here, people value independence, right? Kids move out when they turn 18, sometimes even earlier, and they start building their own lives separately from their families. This emphasis on individualism is a significant shift for many people from more collectivist societies, for example. And another thing is let's discuss food, for example. In Brazil, we love our rice and beans. It's staple. We eat it almost every day. In the US, meals are quite different. There's a lot of fast food, burgers, fries, and the portion sizes are ginormous. I remember the first time I ordered a meal here, I couldn't believe how big it was. It was almost enough to feed a small family back home, right? This isn't just a Brazilian observation. Many people from around the world are surprised by the portion sizes in the US. Also, people here drink a lot of soda. In Brazil, we love our fresh juices, for example. Orange juice, mango juice, passion fruit, whatever. But here, it's all about soda, and of course, they love coffee. But not the kind that the small, strong coffees we have back home, for example. Here, it's this huge cups with, coffee that people carry around all day. It's a different coffee culture altogether. Another cultural shock that I had was the work culture. In Brazil, we have a more relaxed approach to work. We value our leisure time and we take long lunches, for example. Here, people eat lunches on their desk. There's this culture of always being busy. Vacation time is also much shorter. Back home, it's common to have 4 weeks of vacation per year, for example. Here, people are lucky if they get 2 weeks. This work-centric lifestyle is something that many people from other countries find it hard to adapt to. Let's talk about cars. In Brazil, not everyone owns a car, especially in big cities like São Paulo or Rio. Public transportation is widely used, even though it's not always the most effective or efficient. Here in the US, especially outside of the big cities like New York or San Francisco, it's almost impossible to get around without a car. The public transportation system is not as developed and everything is so spread out, right? Also, the cars are huge. People drive massive SUVs and pickup trucks. In Brazil, we have smaller cars because the streets are so narrow and, gas is really expensive. Here, gas is really cheap, especially if you compare, and people don't think twice about driving these big vehicles, right? And speaking of driving, let's talk about the driving culture. In Brazil, driving can be a bit chaotic. People don't always follow the rules strictly, and there's a lot of honking and gesturing. Here in the US, people are more disciplined on the road. They follow the speed limits, stop at stop signs, and generally respect traffic laws. But one thing that was a little bit confusing for me was the concept of four-way stops. In Brazil, we have roundabouts and maybe traffic lights, right? But not intersections where everyone stops and you have to figure out who goes next based on who arrived there first. Took me a while to get used to that. I imagine people from many countries might, find this system a bit maybe hard to understand at first. Another difference is the drinking culture. In Brazil, the legal drinking age is 18, and it's common for young people to go out and have a beer with friends, for example. Here, the legal drinking age is 21, and they're very strict about it. The first time I went to a bar in the US, I was already over 21, but they asked me for my ID, and I didn't have it with me at that time, so they wouldn't let me in. Back home, nobody asks for the ID unless you look really, really young. Also, open container laws are different. In Brazil, you can walk around with a beer in your hand and it's no big deal. Here, in most places, you can't have an open alcoholic beverage in public, right? That's something I had to unlearn to avoid getting in trouble, for example. Now, let's talk about the tipping culture. In Brazil, tipping is not a big deal. Sometimes you leave a small tip, maybe 10%, but it's not expected, right? The service charge is often included in the bill. Here in the US, tipping is a whole different story. You're expected to tip at least 15%, sometimes 20, 25%, even if the service wasn't that great. And it's not just in restaurants. You tip bartenders, the hairdresser, taxi driver, everybody. At first, I found it confusing a bit and maybe a little bit overwhelming. I had to get used to calculating the tips, all the time. Also, the prices you see are not the prices you pay. In Brazil, the price tags include the taxes. If something costs 10 reais, you pay 10 reais at the checkout. Here in the US, you see a price tag, but when you go to pay, they add the sales tax on top of the price. It's a small thing, but it took me a while to get used to it. Another thing that surprised me is how everything is so convenient here. You have drive-through basically for everything. Banks, pharmacies, even weddings in Las Vegas, for example. In Brazil, we don't have that. You actually have to get out of your car and go inside. I guess it ties back to the, car-centric culture that they have here, right? Now, let's move on to talk about the difference between the United States and Brazil, or perhaps between the US and many other countries. One major difference is the sense of security. In Brazil, especially in big cities, we're always a bit cautious about safety. We have bars on the windows, high walls around our houses, and we're careful about walking alone at night. Here in the US, while there are places you need to be a little bit more cautious, I generally feel safer walking around anytime, anywhere, basically, even at night. Another big difference is the education system. In Brazil, public universities are considered to be the best, and they are free. Private universities are expensive and often not as prestigious, right? Here in the US, it's the opposite. Best universities are private and very expensive. Student debt is a huge issue here, which is something we don't deal with back home. Healthcare is another big difference. In Brazil, we have a public healthcare system called SUS, and it's essentially free. It's not perfect, but but it's available to everyone. Here, healthcare is so expensive and not everyone has insurance. First time I went to a doctor's appointment and saw the bill, I was shocked. It made me appreciate the healthcare system we have back in Brazil despite its flaws, right? Now, let's talk about some expectations versus realities. Before moving to the US, I had certain ideas about what life here would look like. I thought everyone lived like in the movies, with big houses, white picket fences, and perfect lawns. While that's true in some suburban areas, there's a lot of diversity in how people live here. I also expected Americans to be cold and unfriendly. That's a stereotype that sometimes exists in, I guess, many countries, right? Brazil and whatever. But I found that people here are generally very polite and friendly, even if it's in a different way than back home. They might not be as physically affectionate, but they're willing to help and are very respectful. One thing I didn't expect was the level of diversity here. In Brazil, we consider ourselves a melting pot, essentially, but in the US, it's another level. You meet people from all over the world. In big cities, you can find neighborhoods like Chinatown, Little Italy, or areas with large Hispanic communities, Africans, or Asian communities. It's amazing to experience so many cultures in one place. However, I was also surprised by the level of racial tension here. In Brazil, we have issues with racism, but it's often not discussed openly. Here in the US, it's a major topic, and people are very vocal about it. It was eye-opening for me to see the extent of the problem and how it affects people's lives. Another expectation I had was that Americans don't know much about other countries. That's a stereotype we have in Brazil and, elsewhere. But I found that many Americans are actually very knowledgeable and interested in other cultures, other countries, and whatnot. Of course, there are people that are not, but that's true everywhere, I guess. Now, let's talk about some of my favorites and least favorites, some of my frustrations and nice surprises. For example, best drivers and worst drivers in the United States. My favorite places in the US are Chicago for its beautiful lake and vibrant, city life, New York City for its energy and diversity, and Colorado for its stunning mountains and outdoor activities. Least favorite places in the US? Honestly, I don't think I have a least favorite place here. Sometimes, in less diverse areas, people would look at me, like, oh, you're not from around here, are you? But overall, I've had all great experiences. Best drivers in the US, I think people in the Midwest are pretty good drivers, polite, patient for the most part. And the worst, drivers, well, sorry, have to say, but drivers in Massachusetts, can be very aggressive. So, they're commonly known as mass holes just because we drive aggressively. That's where I got my driver's license first time, and I drive aggressively, gotta say. Traffic there is intense and people are always in a hurry as well. So that probably contributes to it. Here's a few things that I found frustrating and some nice surprises in the US. First, I was frustrated by how difficult it can be to make close friends here. People are friendly on the surface, but it takes time to build deeper relationships. In Brazil, we make friends very easily, and our social circles are very important to us. I think many people from other countries might feel the same way once they move here. Also, I miss the spontaneity of life back home sometimes. In the US, people plan everything in advance. If you want to hang out with someone, you need to schedule it weeks ahead. In Brazil, in many other cultures, you can call a friend and meet up the same day. Now, for some nice surprises, I was pleasantly surprised by how much people here volunteer and donate to charity. There's a strong culture of giving back to community, right? Also, people are very organized. Things work here, services are efficient, and bureaucracy is less of a headache compared to Brazil. I also love how patriotic people are. They celebrate their national holidays with so much enthusiasm and passion. 4th of July is a big deal, and it's fun to see everyone come together. Back in Brazil, people sometimes think, Americans don't know much about the world outside of the US, but that's just not true. But you know what? I truly disagree with this. The US is such a vast country with so much to see and do, and that's probably the reason, right? Like in Brazil, we can drive a few hours and be in a completely different state with a different culture, but here you can drive for days and still be in the same state. Here in Texas, for example, is a good example of that. So, do I have any regrets? No, not really. Maybe one thing that crossed my mind is that I wish I could have explored more of the country sooner. There's so much diversity in landscapes, from beaches to mountains to deserts. I also wish I had gotten out of my comfort zone earlier, because you miss out on so much when you don't. Moving on to, I guess, the biggest question of all is, would I live here permanently? Given everything I've come to learn about this country, given all the places that I've seen and the experience I've had, the answer is absolutely yes. That's what I'm doing. I would live here in the US forever. And that is what I'm doing right now. And I've been doing that for many years. And I love this country as my own, with all the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't think anyone would ever be able to convince me otherwise. To me, the US offers opportunities and experiences that you can't find anywhere else. But I also love Brazil, right? Sometimes I miss my family, friends, the food, the music, the warmth of people. I'm not sure, but I'll probably split my time between both countries in the future. Who knows? Each place has so much to offer, and I've come to appreciate the best of both worlds, right? So if you're thinking about moving to the US, whether you're from Brazil or any other country, I hope this gives you some insights into what life here is actually like. And if you're an American, maybe this will help you see your country from a different perspective. If you found any of this surprising or funny, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave a comment below. And if you feel like I should visit any specific places here in America, let me know. Those are just, some of my impressions of the United States. It's really hard to condense 7 years of life experience into the short video, but I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're ambitious, love making connections, and are passionate about business like I am, hit me up. Let's connect, all right?